Okay, let's get started. We're getting back to the beginning of philosophy. And we're going to start a little bit before philosophy gets started in the days of what you might call pre-philosophy mythology. What was going on in the Greek world at the time or before the time of the original philosophers? And people were worried about the creation of the cosmos, creation of the universe. Where did it come from? And there were several accounts that were given. One by Hesiod, found in his epic poem called the Theogony. You can take a look at Wikipedia and read about it. And similar accounts come from Homer in his work, The Odyssey and the Iliad. And the picture that they give of the creation of the universe is that of one god impregnating another god. And as a result, the world comes into being. Things start to divide up. And they end up with a picture that sort of looks like this, that we have these gods. There's the earth god, Gaia. There's the ocean god, Tartarus, the underworld god, the heaven. All of these things are not only beings, but they also have a divine nature, divinity, that's accounting for what's going on. So there's a whole myth about how things came into existence. And now notice, if you have an event that occurs, how do they explain back in the mythological era in Greece why it happened? If, for example, there's an earthquake and somebody gets killed, what happened? The god of the underworld was unhappy. If somebody's struck by lightning, Zeus was throwing lightning at him. If somebody goes out fishing in a boat and sinks, the Poseidon, the ocean god, the water god, was mad at him and ended up causing the boat to drown. Notice everything takes on a human-like, an anthropomorphic nature. And you really can't have any kind of explanation of any kind of order. In fact, you don't see any order. The reason things don't look orderly is because you're subject to the whims of these gods. And it's from this background that philosophy gets started. And if we take a look at the selection that I asked you to take a look at from Terence Irwin, his book Classical Philosophy, the chapter on natural philosophy before Plato, and let's take a look at page 33, we begin to see where these first philosophers, and these are, by the way, the same guys that we heard about at the beginning of the semester in that YouTube from Carl Sagan, Cosmos, Thales, and some of his followers. But let's see. Professor Irwin writes, Aristotle calls the early philosophers naturalists, physiologoi, in contrast to the mythological and theological thinkers who preceded them, because they seek a rational understanding of nature, Greek word for nature being physis, like physics. He sees that in describing their inquiry into the world as an inquiry into nature, the early philosophers assume some general principles about the scope and form of their inquiry. That is, they're trying to find out what is the nature of something. We speak of X's nature both in saying what X comes to be from, what brought it forth, and in saying what it's in fact made of. These are two ways of speaking of nature. These two ways of speaking of nature often pick out the same thing. A house is built from brick and mortar, and it's also consists of brick and mortar. That's where it came from. Hence, the naturalists seek to discover what things come from and what they consist in. They seek to understand the observed processes and the changes in the natural world by tracing them to their underlying constituents, the things that they're made from. An underlying constituent is a principle. In Greek, arche, or beginning. Beginning's English, by the way. Hence, the naturalists inquire into the principles. That is, they're looking, what is the principle that got the universe started? This inquiry leads naturalists to look for laws and explanations underlying a variety of changes that we observe. When Herodotus describes the nature of a crocodile, and the Hippocratic writer describes the nature of the so-called sacred disease, that is, epilepsy was referred to back in ancient Greece as the sacred disease, they describe the regular and permanent traits manifest in the behavior of the animal or the disease. A search for the permanent trait leads the naturalist to the underlying constitution of things. This underlying constitution is hard to find. Heraclitus warns, we'll get to Heraclitus later, warns the investigator that that nature tends to hide. So the idea so far that we see is what we're seeing at the beginning of philosophy is that they're looking for an explanation of what the nature of the universe is. And in looking for the nature, they're looking for what got it started and, at the same time, what is it composed of. To look for explanations involving nature is to assume that something's behavior can be explained by laws and regularities in its own constitution. This assumption did not seem obviously correct to the contemporaries of the naturalists. They were used to explanations that referred to interventions, as we just mentioned, by capricious gods. Capricious, you know what that word means? Caprice. Just by whim, they're doing it basically for no reason. They felt like kind of a random act, which caused things to behave in unexpected ways. The naturalists implicitly reject such views in confining their explanation to nature. That is, the people who follow the Greek mythology, the god stories, could not find or did not look for regular patterns because the events that occurred in the world were caused by the random acts of gods. But the naturalists, the people who got philosophy started, are the people who very specifically were looking or found an order in things. Now notice we're looking at Aristotle. Aristotle was really the originator of the history of philosophy. In some of his books, he spends quite a bit of time talking about the guys that we're going to be talking about, the philosophers. We're talking about the pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic meaning before Socrates, before Plato's teacher Socrates. But actually it applies to a few philosophers who lived at the same time, were contemporaries of Plato. And let's go on and see what Irwin tells us in a few more pages. We have a quote from Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he's talking about the original philosophers and their material principle for getting the world started. Let us enlist those who previously took up the investigation of the existing things and pursued philosophical study about the truth. For it is clear that they also mention causes and principles of some sort. These are the guys who are looking for the truth. They're not buying the mythology, but they're looking for the causes, the principles, or some sort of thing that can explain the cosmos. Remember Carl Sagan at the beginning of the semester in that YouTube made the point, cosmos versus chaos. Cosmos is there's an order to things. There are principles and causes that we can follow and understand. A discussion of their views then will advance our present line of inquiry. Excuse me. For either we shall find some other kind of cause, or we shall have more confidence in those that we have just mentioned. Most of the philosophers thought that the only principles of everything were material. That is, matter was the ultimate principles. For they say, there is some subject that all existing things come from. This is the first thing they come to be from, and the last thing they perish into, they dissolve into, so to speak. This substance remains throughout and changes by being affected in different ways. So there's some matter that remains throughout the entire existence of things. This is the elementary basis and origin of beings. This is the most fundamental principle that governs their existence. For this reason, they think nothing either comes to be or perishes, since they assume that in every change this nature perishes. So the idea is matter doesn't come into existence and doesn't go out of existence. It's a doctrine that was held for a very long time in physics, because they assume that any time there's a change, it's a change from one type of thing to another type of thing. For we say Socrates does not become unqualifiedly whenever he becomes good or musical, and does not perish unqualifiedly when he loses these states. For the subject, Socrates himself remains. The idea is Socrates remains, the substance remains. He becomes good or he becomes musical, no longer. It loses his talents in these areas, but the subject itself, the matter that Socrates, whatever that being is, stays the same. In the same way, then they say nothing else either comes to be or perishes unqualifiedly, since there must be some nature, either one or more than one, that persists while the other things come to be from it. Continuing on. But they do not all agree about the number or type of this material principle. That is, all the naturalists, our first pre-Socratics, the Milesians that we're talking about, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, we're going to see, all have as their principle, their arche, the thing that gets the world going and it makes up, they all have some material thing, what they're calling a material principle. Thales, the originator of this sort of philosophy, says it is water. That is why he also declared that the earth rests on water. Presumably he reached this view from seeing that what nourishes all things is wet, and that hot itself comes from the wet and is kept alive by it. And what all things come to be from is their principle. So water is the principle. Another reason he reached this view was that he thought that the seeds of all things have a wet nature, and water is the principle of the nature of wet things. So we're beginning to see the views of Thales, and we see that Thales and his immediate successors are looking for some kind of material principle, a kind of matter that is going to explain what brought the cosmos into existence and what continues, what explains, or what explains what it is made of or what it is composed of.